In the dawn of summer 1314, the Scottish lowlands lay shrouded in mist. Rivers wound through fields dotted with small villages, their timber-framed homes fragile against the weight of history pressing upon them. This was not a quiet land. It was a territory brimming with tension, a crossroads where loyalties and ambitions collided in ways both visible and hidden. Across the hills, the stirrings of rebellion were palpable. Yet it was the anticipation of what was about to unfold that made every heartbeat in the region cautious, even anxious. Scotland had been under the shadow of English dominion for years, a tenuous yoke tightened by Edward I, whose campaigns had left the countryside scarred with both loss and defiance. The death of Edward in 1307 had opened a fragile window, a chance for a nation weary of occupation to reclaim its destiny. Into this void stepped Robert Bruce, King of Scots, whose path to sovereignty had been neither swift nor uncontested. He was a man defined by the patience of his patience and the ferocity of his resolve. By 1314, his position had grown perilously strong, yet every move was a calculated risk. Each settlement he reinforced, each knight he summoned, carried weight, not merely of military strategy but of national identity itself. The English crown, now under Edward II, faced a Scotland that refused to bend. Edward II was ill-prepared for the subtleties of insurgency. Unlike his father, he lacked the instinct for relentless pressure. His advisors favored overwhelming numbers, believing that sheer force could crush the stubborn defiance of Bruce's men. By early June, an army of roughly 20,000 men, an amalgam of knights, infantry, and levies, was gathered, a force intended to assert English dominion once and for all. It was a number that might have inspired fear in any other context, yet in the hills of Scotland, statistics were often meaningless in the face of terrain and tactical ingenuity. Bruce, by contrast, commanded around 2,000 armored knights and a larger contingent of lightly equipped foot soldiers. His forces were far smaller, but every soldier was chosen with care. These were men who knew the land intimately, who understood the shifting winds over the rivers, the depth of the mud after spring rains, and the choke points hidden in the seemingly open fields. To an untrained eye, the disparity in numbers suggested inevitable defeat for Bruce, yet he had spent years cultivating an understanding of asymmetric warfare, a doctrine as psychological as it was physical. The tension in the Scottish countryside was not born merely of the army's sizes, but the strategic choke points that defined the land. Bannockburn itself, a stream cutting through marshy fields, provided a natural defensive anchor. On either side, gentle rises of earth could conceal the movements of troops, and narrow passes could funnel an enemy into deadly congestion. Bruce recognized that these features would be his greatest allies. The English army, confident in their numerical superiority, would be forced to attack along constrained avenues, exposing their formations to devastating countermeasures. Months before the battle, Bruce had positioned his forces carefully, constructing rudimentary fortifications and establishing lines of communication among his units. Scouts moved silently through the countryside, mapping the terrain and reporting on the progress of Edward's advance. Every hillock, every patch of bog was accounted for. The king understood that the fight was as much about psychological endurance as physical confrontation. Morale would become a weapon. The confidence of English knights, accustomed to sweeping victories, could be undermined by the first signs of disorder. Meanwhile, Edward II, seated within his encampment south of the River Forth, grappled with the challenges of command. Orders were relayed through layers of hierarchy, each with its own interpretation of intent. Delays and miscommunications were inevitable. Knights awaited their deployment instructions. Infantry prepared to march through terrain they barely knew, and archers arranged themselves without full knowledge of where the enemy might strike. In a war of numbers, these administrative frictions often proved as deadly as any arrow or sword. As the Scottish king prepared, the psychological dimension of warfare became apparent. Bruce's men were motivated by a cause larger than themselves. These were not conscripts fighting out of obligation. They were a nation asserting its identity. The English, for all their training and wealth, carried the burden of expectation. To lose to a smaller, more agile opponent would not merely be a military failure. It would be a stain on the honor of the realm. This unspoken pressure would shape every decision on the battlefield, influencing when to advance, when to hold, and when to retreat. On the eve of confrontation, scouts reported the approach of the English host. Mist hung low over the Bannockburn fields, obscuring the swelling columns of cavalry and infantry. Bruce's forces remained largely concealed, dispersed among natural barriers and temporary fortifications. The contrast in posture could not have been starker. One side, vast and exposed, relying on the weight of its numbers. The other, compact and deliberate, leveraging both terrain and timing. In these final hours before battle, the strategic tension reached a boiling point. Edward II faced a choice: force an attack through constricted terrain, risking disorder, or delay, potentially allowing Bruce to further entrench. Delay carried its own dangers. Scottish raiding parties could harass supply lines, morale could shift, and political pressure would mount. Edward opted for immediate action, confident in the ability of his knights to break through opposition, yet underestimating the environmental and psychological traps that Bruce had meticulously prepared. Meanwhile, Bruce moved among his commanders with quiet authority. He inspected defensive positions, adjusted the placement of spearmen, and reassured units whose nerves were fraying under the looming threat. Leadership here was not flamboyant. It was practical, grounded, and precise. Every decision had consequences that could not be undone once the first charge began. Soldiers understood the stakes, and that understanding transformed their fear into controlled anticipation. In that calm tension, a fragile balance held, one that would soon shatter with the clash of steel and the cries of men. As night fell, the landscape seemed to hold its breath. Rivers whispered through reeds, and the hills stood silent as sentinels. For the English army, the morning promised a certainty of action. For the Scots, it offered the chance to turn disadvantage into triumph. In the shadows of Bannockburn, history teetered on a knife's edge. The stage was set not just for a battle of armies, but for a demonstration of how strategy, terrain, and psychology could overturn the apparent logic of numbers. By the first light of June 23rd, 1314, the mist lifted to reveal two armies separated by both space and expectation. One force, disciplined and massive, believed in the inevitability of victory. The other, smaller and deliberate, understood that every advantage had been cultivated with precision. Here, in these fields outside Stirling, the fate of Scotland would be decided. The tension was not merely tactical, it was existential. And in the stillness before engagement, one truth became undeniable. This battle would not be won by men alone, but by the careful orchestration of every decision, every position, every calculated risk. Bannockburn was more than a battlefield. It was the crucible in which leadership, strategy, and national identity would collide. Bruce had transformed a numerical weakness into a tactical instrument. Edward II, confident in overwhelming numbers, was about to discover the limits of mass power when confronted with terrain, timing, and enemy who understood both intimately. In the coming hours, the decisions made in these quiet pre-dawn moments would echo across Scotland for generations. Knights would charge, spearmen would brace, and the first clash of banners would signal the unraveling of assumptions about superiority. The battlefield was ready. History, patient and impartial, awaited the unfolding drama. Dawn broke over Bannockburn with a cold, diffused light, turning the mist into a thin veil that clung to the marshes and meadows. The Scottish army, though smaller, was already in position, its spearmen and infantry lining the natural barriers, interspersed with compact formations of knights. These were men whose armor reflected the pale light in brief glimmers, not to dazzle, but to intimidate subtly, a visual reminder that discipline could compensate for numbers. They understood the terrain intimately. The narrow fields, the hidden ditches, the shallow streams that could trip the cavalry of an overconfident enemy. Edward II's army appeared on the horizon, a living tide of color and steel. Knights rode in gleaming formations, banners snapping in the wind. Infantry trailed behind, long pikes in hand, archers ready on the flanks. Yet even at this scale, cracks were already forming. The columns were long and unwieldy, the coordination between units precarious, and the psychological weight of expected triumph pressing heavily upon men who had rarely faced an enemy operating with both terrain and timing as its weapon. The English army was powerful, but in its confidence lay a vulnerability that Bruce had been preparing to exploit for years. The English knights, trained for frontal assaults and open field charges, were immediately constrained by the terrain. Bannockburn's fields, hemmed by marshes and streams, allowed only narrow avenues of advance. Any concentrated cavalry charge would funnel into these choke points, exposing horses and riders to a hail of spears and concealed obstacles. The Scottish formations were arranged precisely to take advantage of this. Long rows of spearmen bristling outward, interspersed with units of archers and lightly armored foot soldiers ready to harass and delay. Here, the battlefield itself became a weapon, each hillock and ditch magnifying the strategic acumen of the Scots. The first movements were cautious. Scottish scouts skirmished with forward English detachments, probing the enemy's disposition. Edward II's knights interpreted this as harassment rather than the tip of a calculated strategy, and the main force began advancing in column, confident that the weight of their numbers could compel Bruce to retreat or break. Yet the Scots did not yield. Each unit held its ground with unwavering discipline, presenting a psychological and physical barrier that forced hesitation in the English advance. In these early moments, the role of commanders was critical. Bruce moved along the front with measured calm, observing how each unit held against probing attacks. Decisions had to be instantaneous, and yet grounded in the long arc of strategic planning. Where one flank threatened to overextend, he reinforced it with additional spearmen. Where the marshy ground slowed English knights, he adjusted the positioning of foot soldiers to maximize pressure. Every decision amplified the psychological tension. The English were beginning to perceive that their numerical advantage might not translate into victory. The first major engagement came when a contingent of English cavalry attempted to exploit a perceived weak point on the Scottish right. Horses sank into mud along the edge of the Bannockburn stream, unbalancing the riders. Spearmen, braced and disciplined, held firm. The clash was sudden and brutal. For every knight that struck, there were 2 or 3 who found themselves caught in pikes or unseated by treacherous footing. The English, trained to expect fluid movement and shock impact, faced confusion and mounting frustration. Their momentum was checked not by overwhelming force, but by careful preparation and precise positioning. Meanwhile, Scottish infantry moved with quiet efficiency. They did not seek glory but effectiveness. Archers positioned on slight, risers rained arrows into approaching English units, targeting horses as much as riders. Foot soldiers filled gaps, extended lines, and used the natural terrain to impede any cavalry breakthrough. What might have been a rout of a smaller army became a test of endurance, concentration, and tactical adaptability. The battlefield, in essence, amplified the skills of the smaller force while eroding the confidence of the larger. Edward II attempted to rally his knights. Standard-bearers urged forward, commanders shouted over the din, and trumpets sounded for coordinated charges. Yet coordination was increasingly difficult. Muddy ground, narrow lanes, and dense Scottish formations made it nearly impossible for cavalry units to charge side by side. Horses collided. Riders became entangled, and the famed discipline of the English knights began to falter under the combined weight of environment and resistance. It was here that psychological strain compounded physical obstacles. Men accustomed to decisive victories hesitated, and hesitation in war is often fatal. Bruce's use of mobile reserves was decisive. Small units of mounted knights, fewer in number but agile and familiar with the terrain, harassed exposed flanks, forcing English detachments to divert attention. Where one formation began to push forward, these reserves would appear behind or to the side, sowing confusion. The English army, massive yet inflexible, struggled to respond. In effect, Bruce transformed numerical inferiority into a tool to control chaos, forcing the English to fight not as a single force, but as a series of disjointed engagements. The tension along the Scottish lines was equally palpable. Spears had to hold against repeated charges. Archers had to maintain focus despite the thunder of hooves. Knights had to time counterattacks perfectly. One misstep could unravel the delicate balance Bruce had engineered. Yet each soldier seemed aware that the cohesion of the army itself was a weapon, that discipline and positioning could overcome even overwhelming numbers. The collective psychology of the Scottish forces became as decisive as any individual act of courage. The battle evolved slowly, deliberately, in fits and pulses. Charges would surge, meet resistance, falter, and recede. Each engagement taught lessons instantaneously. Where English momentum could be checked, where terrain could be exploited, and where psychological strain could tip a soldier from confidence to fear. Every move was observed, every reaction accounted for. Bruce's command was not flamboyant, but surgical, small decisions cascading into larger strategic effects. By midday, the English forces had begun to show signs of fragmentation. Their attempt at concentrated cavalry charges repeatedly met with entrenched spearmen and marsh-constrained avenues. Communication breakdowns and mounting confusion caused attachments to act independently, leaving gaps that Scottish reserves were quick to exploit. The psychological impact was visible. Men who had expected easy triumph now confronted the paradox of numerical dominance rendered impotent by terrain, discipline, and the cunning of smaller but highly organized force. Amid this unfolding chaos, the Scottish knights exploited momentum when opportunity arose. Quick, decisive charges struck at exposed flanks. These were not reckless attacks. They were calculated, each maneuver designed to destabilize the English formations further. A knight unhorsed here, a flank exposed there, compounded by the unyielding line of spearmen and the obstructing marshes, began to erode the cohesion of Edward's army. Slowly and methodically, Bruce's strategy revealed itself not as a defensive posture, but as a precise orchestration of attrition and disruption. By late afternoon, the English army's advance had lost much of its initial momentum. Coordination faltered, morale weakened, and the initial belief in inevitable victory began to crack. Every failed charge reinforced the perception that the terrain, the enemy, and their own overconfidence had created a battlefield they could not dominate. Bannockburn had begun to transform from a simple engagement into a psychological trial, testing the limits of endurance, leadership, and tactical reasoning for the English commanders. As the sun began its descent, the stage was set for the decisive confrontation. The English, exhausted by repeated clashes and constrained by geography, faced an enemy whose small size belied its lethal coordination. Bruce's army, disciplined and cohesive, had absorbed the initial assaults while inflicting psychological and physical attrition on the larger force. The balance of the battlefield had shifted subtly but unmistakably. What began as a test of strength had evolved into a trial of skill, leadership, and nerve, where a single miscalculation could determine the outcome of Scotland's struggle for sovereignty. Bannockburn, at this stage, was no longer merely a clash of arms. It had become a study in human psychology under pressure, in the exploitation terrain, and in the power of disciplined, calculated command to overcome overwhelming odds. Every foot of ground contested, every wave of attack repelled, brought the Scottish forces closer to the critical moment when opportunity could be seized with decisive clarity. And as the shadows lengthened across the battlefield, the seeds of collapse in the English ranks were already being sown, imperceptible to those who still believed that numbers alone could secure victory. Every delay, every misaligned charge, every faltering command was a step toward the unraveling that would define the outcome of the day. By late afternoon, the slow, grinding pressure battle had shifted the balance decisively in favor of the Scots. The English army, once confident in its numerical superiority, now struggled against both terrain and coordinated resistance. The choke points that had seemed minor obstacles in theory had become traps in practice. Narrow lanes bogged down cavalry, marshes unseated horses, and spearmen, braced and disciplined, repelled repeated charges. Every failed assault deepened the psychological strain on Edward II's commanders and men alike. It was in this context that Robert Bruce recognized a moment for decisive action. Patience had been his greatest ally. The prolonged engagement had allowed English fatigue, disorganization, and overconfidence to accumulate to the point where a smaller, disciplined force could exploit it fully. The Scottish knights, fewer in number but more agile, mounted a series of sudden, concentrated countercharges against exposed flanks and isolated units. Each strike was precise, targeting the overextended or hesitant English contingents, forcing confusion to spread. A single failure could cascade. The Scots exploited this, ensuring that hesitation in one sector quickly became disorder across others. The first English lines to break were those stretched too thin across the constricted ground. Knights, struggling to maintain cohesion, collided with each other or became entangled in mud, their horses panicking in close quarters. Spearmen held steady, and where a knight faltered, Scottish reserves struck immediately, unbalancing adjacent formations. The English army, once imposing in its sheer size, began to crumble under the relentless combination of environmental pressure and coordinated assault. What remained was no longer an organized force, but a series of fragmented detachments, each reacting independently to the immediate threat without strategic coherence. Edward II's attempts at command grew increasingly desperate. Orders to rally charges were drowned out by the cacophony of battle, the clash of steel, the cries of men, and the hoofbeats of panicked horses. Miscommunication became fatal. Cavalry units charged into occupied lanes. Archers were caught in crossfires, and infantry found themselves isolated from supporting formations. The English had entered Bannockburn confident in mass dominance, yet found themselves trapped in a meticulously orchestrated maze of Scottish resistance. The psychological toll on English troops was immense. Fear, once peripheral, became central. Knights accustomed to decisive, frontal shock attacks hesitated, uncertain where to strike or how to disengage safely. Infantry, untrained in rapid adaptation, became vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. Leadership faltered not from incompetence, but from the relentless strain imposed by terrain, enemy tactics, and the cascading effects of minor failures. At Bannockburn, strategy had become weaponized against both body and mind. Bruce, observing the disintegration of the English advance, directed the next stage with cold efficiency. Scottish formations, held in reserve until now, surged forward. A compact force of mounted knights struck the exposed center, while spearmen tightened their lines against advancing troops. Archers moved to cover these movements, raining bolts into vulnerable areas and further disrupting cohesion. The combined effect was immediate. The English, already destabilized, began to collapse from within, unable to mount coherent counterattacks or maintain formations. As the momentum shifted irreversibly, the battlefield transformed into chaos for the English and order for the Scots. Bruce's smaller forces exploited every weakness. Gaps in lines became corridors for cavalry charges. Exposed flanks fell to coordinated spearmen, and panic spread among units that could no longer rely on the protective mass of their numbers. Horses stumbled, knights were unseated, and soldiers fled, often abandoning comrades in the panic. Bannockburn had become a crucible where discipline, morale, and tactical ingenuity proved far more decisive than the advantage of sheer numbers. The collapse was brutal but systematic. English commanders, unable to regroup their fragmented forces, watched as their lines disintegrated. What had begun as hesitation now became rout. Soldiers broke ranks, fled toward marshes or rivers, and in many cases were cut down before reaching safety. The Scottish pursuit was measured but relentless, ensuring that disorganization turned into catastrophic losses. In less than a day, the expectation of an easy English victory had evaporated entirely, replaced by the harsh reality of defeat inflicted by a smaller, highly coordinated force operating with superior understanding of terrain and timing. The aftermath on the battlefield was stark. Bannockburn's fields bore the marks of intense, close-quarters fighting. Churned mud, abandoned weapons, broken banners, and the bodies of men and horses alike. Yet the strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate devastation. The English army, once seen as an unstoppable instrument of dominance, had been humbled in a single, decisive encounter. Edward II survived the day but lost the authority and confidence of his army, while Bruce emerged not merely as a tactical victor, but as a symbol of Scottish resilience and sovereignty. Politically, the victory at Bannockburn reverberated throughout Britain and Europe. It solidified Robert Bruce's claim to the Scottish throne, discouraging further large-scale incursions from England for years. More importantly, it demonstrated that a smaller, well-led, and terrain-savvy force could decisively defeat a numerically superior opponent, a lesson in strategy and psychology that resonated far beyond the fields of Bannockburn. Military historians would later cite the battle as a quintessential example of the interplay between terrain, leadership, and morale in determining outcomes that numbers alone could not.